Hey everybody, welcome to tonight's lecture in Media and Politics. Um, Although I said tonight, but I guess it's really this morning when most of you will be watching this. But it's Monday, March 30th, and I hope that everybody is feeling healthy, at least physically healthy, if not mentally healthy. I know that we're all dealing with a lot of things right now, but just wanted to give you all a quick update on my situation. Obviously, I spent the weekend at home with my family, and all of us are healthy, thankfully, and we are practicing social distancing as best we can. Made a quick trip to Target this morning to stock up on groceries, but otherwise, we were um, at our house for the whole weekend, and kind of enjoying good weather and trying as best we can to make some sort of routine and some sense of normal out of what are really abnormal times. And I hope that all of you are doing well and are healthy as well. So on tap for tonight, I wanted to say a few words about the first discussion board post assignment, which was due on Friday, March 27th. And if you haven't turned it in yet, please go ahead and do it as quickly as possible if you can. I know, again, that we're all dealing with a lot of things right now, but I have graded all of those discussion boards. The grades should be appearing in the grade book in Canvas. And then we are going to talk about media or mediated rather presidential campaigns, which is sort of the first topic of the syllabus this week. And we'll talk a bit about how the media and its coverage of presidential campaigns has evolved over time. But for now, just a few words about the first discussion board assignment. So I was actually very struck by y'all's responses. I found them to be genuine. I found them to be sort of universal in the sense that we're all sort of struggling with how best to deal with information right now. And in many cases, I found them really pretty touching, actually. And I think what it has come down to for me, and I get the sense that some of y'all are in this boat as well, which I'm really trying to look at the usefulness of whatever information it is I'm taking in at the moment. And I've really found myself devolving to where I'm basically just checking the news at night. And I think this is like a function of a couple of things. Like one, I just realized I really needed to limit the intake of information that I was getting. And the other thing is I'm just really busy during the day with family stuff. So I just don't have that much time. But um, my wife and I kind of get caught up on the news at night. I may have mentioned this last week, but I actually disabled New York Times push notifications on my phone, which is a really big deal for me because that's one way that I tend to get information, and now no longer. And I've got to tell you, I've not missed them at all. It's been great. So I think thinking about the usefulness of information, and if you think about it, think about like sitting on your couch during a big Texas storm, right? And all of a sudden you get an update to your phone that says a tornado is headed directly for your house, right? Like that is the most immediately useful kind of mediated communication that you could possibly receive, right? And one of the confusing things about the media and this situation is much of it is reported with the same kind of breathless urgency that a tornado warning heading straight for your house would be reported on. But the thing is, these tornadoes are happening like a really far way away in some ways, or in some instances, really not so close to here always. And the second thing is, it can be really hard to sort of take the scene in Italy or take the scene in New York and kind of picture what that might look like in Texas. And it may be that here in North Texas, our cases never peak in such a sort of dreadful way as they have in Italy and as they have in New York. It may be that we live further apart. It may be that the warm weather helps to slow the spread of the virus, whatever it is. Or it may be that It's just as bad here. I think we just don't know yet. As I think on average, the first sort of when COVID-19 patients tend to become hospitalized is about 14 days into getting sick. And so if we went on essentially a quarantine in the city of Dallas, obviously last Monday, so going on 6 days from now. So it's quite possible that the disease is of course out here in the community and is transmitting, and that the people who are going to be getting the most sick have just not gotten that sick yet. So that's certainly a possibility. But I think in this time of uncertainty, it's important to try and realize how helpful the information is and how immediately useful the information is that you are getting. All right, so on to the topic of today's lecture, which is mass media and its coverage of presidential campaigns. So we've got some key points here. The first is that we'll talk a little bit about the history of how the media has covered presidential campaigns and how that history has evolved over time. And the whole sort of discussion that we're going to have is going to be rooted in this idea that, of course, we've covered a lot in this three-legged relationship between the press, politicians, and the voters. I actually accidentally put press and mass media on here, but it should be press, politicians, and voters. Press and mass media are the same thing. And the third sort of key point that will kind of ground this discussion is the transition from the old ways of doing things to the new sort of press and candidate relationships. And in the case of the Trump campaign, but really this even predates the Trump campaign, we saw the relationship between journalists and candidates move from a symbiotic relationship to one that is instead quite antagonistic. Although not always antagonistic, there are some examples to the contrary. But we'll talk about how that relationship has evolved. So here are the basics. So contemporary presidential election campaigns, right? So what presidential election campaigns look like in the modern era are essentially mass media campaigns. And the reason for this is something that we've talked about a lot in class, which is America is an enormous country. We have 330 million citizens. There is, of course, but one president. There are often only two serious presidential candidates by the time both parties have had their nominating conventions. And as a result, there is just simply no way that a majority, even a small minority of Americans are going to get to witness these candidates in person over and over and over again in a way that would allow them to make judgments about the candidate's qualification to become president. And so as a result, almost everything that Americans know about a presidential candidate comes from the media. And so while the media does not determine what happens in the campaign, for a large majority of voters, the campaign is whatever the media version of it is, right? We have no reality except for what the media says is happening. We just don't, right? So you can imagine if, I don't know, imagine that you work at a store and the press publishes a story about the store that you work in and you feel like they've gotten it wrong, right? And the reason why you know that they've gotten it wrong is because you work there and you see that this little snapshot of time that is a media article or a news segment or whatever about this place that you work, yeah, it may be one sort of version or one frame of reality, but the actual reality of it is so much different. And you can think of a campaign as the same thing, right? We just receive these snippets of whatever mass media determines is a reality. And on the ground, things may be very different. And truthfully, that just doesn't matter that much, right? Because if the mediated version is the only version we get, then why should reality matter at all? So the media, quite rightfully and quite rationally, have become the primary focus of candidates' campaign efforts, and the ability to shape their coverage, and candidates tend to direct their activities toward getting their messages, their characteristics, and their qualifications through the media as often and as favorably as they can. So, one really interesting piece of research that I came across when I was prepping today's lecture is this study from the Social Science Research Council, which took a look at the 1976 presidential election, which, of course, was an election between Gerald Ford for the Republicans and Jimmy Carter for the Democrats. And Jimmy Carter actually ended up winning this election. He was, of course, a one-term president. He was beaten by Ronald Reagan in 1980. Um, but the SSRC published this report on how the media covered the 1976 presidential election. And I thought a lot of things about this were really interesting. So, the first is that they covered both sides of the sort of media equation, which we've talked a lot about in here. So, how does the agenda get formed? How does the media form its agenda? This is, of course, a media as a dependent variable study. And then, what's the impact of this media coverage on the American people? And here, of course, media is the independent variable. And they used a combination of content analysis to try to determine what the coverage actually looks like, and then interviews that they conducted with the same group of people over periods of time to try to determine what the impact of media coverage was on these people's views. And they found that the press tended to concentrate on the strategic game that was played by the candidates and did not emphasize policy nor leadership qualities that the candidates may have possessed. And things used to be the exact opposite. So, for example, in 1940, Lazarsfeld, who was a sociologist, but he found that 35% of the news in the 1940 presidential election concerned the horse race, right? So, who's winning, who's losing, why, how, and 50% concerned policy and leadership. And this is interesting because in 1976, those proportions were exactly reversed. So less on policy, less on leadership, much more about who's winning. Why do you think this change happened? It did happen, right? What the research demonstrates is that it did happen. And now our next question as media scholars is to try to figure out why. And I think there are several answers. So the first is that presidential campaigns are just long. Um, Trump declared his candidacy for the presidency, for example, in June of 2015 and was not elected until November of 2016. So that's a 17-month campaign. Of course, the Democrats in our current in the current field of candidates, outright declared their candidacies a long time ago, but many were unofficially running really from the second that Trump was sworn into office. So not only are campaigns longer, there's just more media, right? There are also more hours of the news day that need to be filled. And of course, the news day is now as long as the calendar day. And so when 24-hour news networks, that means there's 24 hours worth of coverage. And of course, policy can only take you so far, and especially sort of detailed, what can often be dry comparisons of candidates' policies. It just may not take us very long. So, how do reporters actually report on political campaigns and on presidential campaigns, and how has this changed over time, and what has Trump done to this relationship? So, the classic metaphor of the press and presidential campaigns is this idea of the boys on the bus. So, typically, the way this used to work, and before there were buses, there were trains, but there would be either separate train cars or after buses became widespread, there would be separate press buses. And these newspaper men, and they were almost always men, and they were almost always newspaper reporters. And of course, this changed a little bit, particularly after the election of John F. Kennedy in 1960, when people realized the power of television to shape a candidate's image. But before that, mostly men, all white men, highly educated, sort of hard bitten newspaper men. And they would be on a separate bus. They would follow the candidate around. They would socialize with the candidate's advisors. There was a lot of alcohol. There was a sort of, I don't want to say a party like atmosphere, but a definite recognizance of both sides that this relationship was symbiotic. So the newspapermen needed the access that the candidate's advisors provided, and the candidate, of course, needed the newspapermen to craft his, and it was almost always he, to craft his, not only his message, but really what the public thought of the candidate, right? There was no Twitter back then. Oftentimes, there were very limited appearances on television or in newsreels, for example. And there was certainly no Twitter, right? And so we'll talk in a minute about what Trump's use of social media has done to this boys on the bus phenomenon. But essentially, each candidate's press corps used to be almost entirely male. They were sequestered together for really long stretches, and they were almost always under only one daily deadline. So a newspaper would require the reporter to file a story at night so that it would appear in the next day's paper. And of course, now there is still a nightly deadline or an afternoon deadline in many cases for a story to appear in the print issue of a newspaper, but there's nothing that limits reporters on the internet to having only one deadline a day, right? So you can, of course, file stories whenever, you can tweet them out, they can appear on the newspaper's website whenever. So essentially, the press corps is now a much more diverse place in almost every way possible. So there are many more females, it's much younger, it's less white, and there are also endless deadlines that these reporters face. There's also not as much what we call pack journalism, because there are fragmented outlets with very different sort of viewer typologies. And the other thing that the proliferation and the sort of explosion of the number of outlets has done is, and in particular, Twitter has done this, but it essentially gives senior reporters, right? So, like New York Times reporters, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post reporters, and just some person off the street with a blog, it gives them the same outlet. And the only difference that it provides that New York Times reporter and some random off the street is the blue check mark, right? But how often are people going to really even realize how viable the source is, right? And so this is sort of one of the main themes, I think, of this class is that Twitter and Facebook and these other social media websites have really served to flatten and democratize the information environment. And that's great whenever it allows you to, you know, get in touch with your grandma or something who lives across the country. But it's tough when you may not be as media literate as somebody else and you're trying to make sense of what seems like a very impossible to understand mix of information. So one correspondent who sort of was quoted in this Boys on the Bus story is that said it was a much better time actually when the press corps had intimate access to the candidates, which they did back then and they don't often anymore. And the press could actually personally cultivate relationships with actual candidates. And now things are much more buttoned down and they're much less freewheeling. And the idea is that I think that what journalists bemoan is that they don't get a sense of who the candidate actually is because they're only with them during these very sort of prescribed, regimented exercises. It's really interesting to look at the Trump campaign in this respect because in some ways you think of Trump as being super antagonistic to the press, and he obviously is in many, many ways. However, reporters who cover the White House have said in his own weird way, he's like more accessible to them than Barack Obama ever was. And he's more accessible, really, than almost any other modern president. LBJ was also very accessible as well. LBJ was also had a very narcissistic personality, so I don't know if that's something that they may have in common. But yeah, Trump just calls up reporters all the time, apparently, which is something that obviously the Obama administration, which tried to have a much tighter grip over its message, did not do. So Trump quite clearly dominated the media landscape during the 2016 presidential campaign. And he did so, though, in a way that was completely and utterly different than previous successful campaigns. He used no focus groups, he used almost no pollsters, he used almost no outside speechwriters, and he ran very few television ads. Of course, why run television ads when you're getting um, essentially hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars worth of paid media for free every night as the major networks were covering his campaign rallies, which they still, of course, do. So Trump ran almost explicitly against the mass media. And so the result of this, of course, is that for a large segment of the population, Trump's core base of supporters, mainstream media outlets, with the exception of Fox News, have almost no influence at all over the voters that back Trump, right? So anything that occurs from outside of this media bubble, and I think it actually would be really interesting what would happen if Fox News ever turned against the president, because I think his supporters would then turn against Fox News as well. But it's really interesting that, you know, almost anything that these other outlets say about the president, regardless of how well reported or um, sort of grounded in the truth, his supporters just see it as more of the same. Of course, more lies, right? And which that's what the president tells them. So how do we know that this is the case? Kind of like I just said, think about how reporting on potential scandals fell on deaf ears, right? Just to name a few, of course, the Grab Them by the P scandal from October of 2016, a month before the election. Very well documented cases reported in the New York Times and the Washington Post about outright fraud committed by Trump's charitable organization, tax evasion efforts by both Trump and his father that have spanned decades, also reported by the New York Times. Of course, the reality of his impeachment, which many viewers of right wing media viewed as illegitimate, of course, and actually was hardly even reported on by Fox News. And there's a media critic out there named Mark Feldstein who wrote a really interesting piece that Trump, during the campaign and also since being elected, has essentially exposed a real institutional weakness of the TV press, but really the press in general in America. And that is that it's set up to be dominated by somebody like Trump, who provides what is commonly referred to as infotainment. So nominally, he's running a presidential campaign, which he was, but the very act of his campaign, its sort of subversive nature, also provides an entertainment event as well. And it's almost like if professional wrestling coincides with the nightly news. You're sort of getting the best of both worlds. So by running such a different, such a norm-breaking campaign, when Trump did anything, even just hold a rally, right, which is something that politicians have been doing for as long as there have been politicians, it was covered as news. This, of course, is not something that other candidates could get. When Marco Rubio in 2016 held a political rally, it was not covered as news, right? When Hillary Clinton covered a rally, it was not covered as news, but because these Trump rallies were such a singular spectacle, and because the networks never knew what the hell was going to come out of his mouth, they were treated as newsworthy events. And so as a result, he held and really continues to hold an attentional advantage in the marketplace of the mind, right? I think I've used the phrase sucks the oxygen out of the room, and I think he does that. I think he sucks the headlines out of the newspaper, right? And off the TV. And I think if we look at coverage of Trump with respect to Bennett's four biases, we really see that evidence of these information biases are in effect all over the place. The dramatization bias, particularly opponents of the president, they tend to report and sort of try to convey that everything that the president does is the worst thing ever, right? So everything is life or death. And we see coverage, especially from inside the Beltway, reporters who view the shattering of these norms as like something that is breaking news. And in some ways, I guess it is breaking news, but as a result, every single thing about the Trump presidency is conflict framed. Also, of course, Trump, the person, tends to dominate coverage. Oftentimes, the implications, the details, this sort of institutionalization of his policies gets much shorter shrift and is not covered in as widespread a way. And of course, the focus on the scandals of the day means that much larger systems at work of power and of subjugation are simply undercovered. And then the authority disorder bias, I mean, this is all over the place as well, but just look at Trump's response or lack thereof to the coronavirus pandemic. What is the White House doing? What has it not done? How has it failed us? Et cetera, et cetera. And so we see that these biases sort of not only pertain to coverage of the Trump campaign, but also, of course, coverage of Trump as he has governed as president. And that is all I have for tonight. If y'all have any questions at all, please do not hesitate to email me. We can set up a time to talk. We're supposed to get some advising language on the department's website at some point this week, including maybe some YouTube videos of faculty members in the department discussing the courses that we're going to be teaching. So stay tuned for that. And please continue to be safe, continue to practice social distancing, and let's all try and flatten the curve. All right, I will talk to you all later. Bye.